In this episode, I host a conversation between Shinzen Young, American meditation teacher and neuroscience research consultant, and Chelsey Fasano, a Columbia University neuroscience student. We take an inside look as Chelsey consults Shinzen on her current research project, a review of the neuroscientific literature that examines states of self-identification and non-dual awareness. In the course of the discussion, Shinzen details the many meanings and connotations of the word Tantra, including its connection to karmamudra, or spiritual sex. He discusses the importance of definitions. Chelsey asks if all traditions lead to the same end, or if different techniques lead to different types of enlightenment. And Shinzen reveals what the gurus of the world must learn from the culture of science. So without further ado, Shinzen Young and Chelsey Fasano. Shinzen Young and Chelsey Fasano, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, everyone.
Hi. So Chelsey, why don't we start off by, if you say a little bit about who you are and the research project you're interested in, and then we'll just go from there.
Mm-hmm. Great. I'm a student at Columbia University, and I'm currently in the beginning stages of doing a research project which looks at meditation from both Buddhist and neuroscientific standpoints. The focus of the project specifically will be looking at experiences and concept of self and non-self from both subjective, neurological, and textual standpoints. My advisors are Dr. Alfredo Spagna, Dr. Nicholas Van Dam, and Dr. Jay Garfield, all of whom I'm very excited to be working with. So I was talking to Steve, and he suggested that I reach out to you, Shinzen, to see if you'd be willing to talk to me about the project, share some of your knowledge, or point me in the right direction in terms of certain obstacles I'm coming across in my research. And as I've been reading your work, I've just been so relieved and excited about how scientific your concepts of meditation are. I found them really, really useful in terms of conveying meditation to my professors, formulating hypotheses and research questions. So I'm very excited to be on the call with you.
Well, you know, not to make ridiculous comparisons, but Richard Feynman once said the happiest thing for him was if he discovered something and then other scientists could find it useful for them. That, you know, that's about as good as it gets. So thanks for giving me that pleasant feel in body sensation that is emotional in nature. This is definitely something we can talk about. I have a few questions though. First, I'd like to actually fill in more of the Chelsey story. Your personal story. And I'm thinking of three parts, one that would precede the research that we're going to discuss today. And then maybe another part would be where you would see yourself at midlife and how that might relate to your academic training now. And then where you would see yourself at end life, or in the what they call Wannian in Chinese, you know, the sunset years, where you would see yourself, and then what immediately preceded this research. And then I can frame it as a story that fits in a larger story.
I'm getting interviewed. Okay, I'll try to make this concise. Who I was in the more distant past, I would say that applies to this project is I stumbled across, you could say, meditation when I was around 16 or 17. And I had the really amazing luck to have some profound experiences quite initially that really made me fall in love with meditation in a way that I think only a teenager can fall in love with something. And I developed this intense passion for the practice. And then I grew up. I'm now 34. And my practice grew up with me. Or so I would like to think. So as I've been developing myself emotionally, psychologically, and intellectually, I've carried with me my concepts of practice, my concepts of self, and my feelings of who I'd like to be and what I'd like to give, and those have evolved through the years. I went back to school 4 years ago because I began to feel that these things are a bit hard to put into words, but that there would be no meaning to my practice unless I could convey it in a way that others could share it.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Yes.
There's an expression that was said of Zen Master Lin Ji. No sooner had he seen it that he could use it. Seeing it is just the beginning. The rest is using it, which is primarily for the benefit of others. So you're spot on in that regard. Sorry to interrupt. There'll be more interruptions. It's my style.
Yeah.
Please continue with the Chelsey story.
So I think I see, I also had a few mentors of mine specifically tell me that it would be best if I used my intellect in service of my devotion. So I began to see them more seamlessly as interrelated. And also through examining the transmission of Eastern concepts to the West, I started to become passionate about how that transmission could be done most accurately and with the most kindness. And for me, that means speaking to people in a language they comprehend naturally, which is science in the West. And so here I am.
Doing it. Excellent. And is the idea that you'll become a professional scientist with this specialty, or is it some other idea? Maybe a meditation teacher, but with a science background, or a therapist, or who knows, some other vector?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I was just talking to my advisor, Professor Spania, about this a few days ago, and we were talking about the trajectory of my intellectual development at Columbia and how, because my motivation has been this deep desire to be of service, I think the way that I do that has been less important to me than doing it, which has made my approach more malleable, as in wherever I think I will be the best fit, I will probably go. But I do see myself and have a serious desire to do clinical work in the future. So I imagine I'll tell you my ultimate dream, and then
what's the ultimate dream?
Then we can see if it happens.
My ultimate dream is to fix the world before I die. So hey,
me too.
That. Oh, good. Okay. It's the same dream. That's another Chinese expression. It's not enough to share the bed, you have to share the dream. That is an expression. So I didn't want to put words into your mouth, though. But
it's my version of fixing the world a little bit. And I think my vision right now of my dream way of getting there would be to somehow convince someone to let me do it, kind of interdisciplinary PhD, studying the intersection of meditation and neuroscience, but also of various classical tantric yoga practices in neuroscience and yogas, sexual yogas and yogas that promote intimacy, and seeing how I can break those practices down and look at what they're doing on a neurological level so I can help people create more intimacy in their lives.
You'd get a PhD with the neuroscience of intimacy.
Exactly.
And then would that lead to a career? Well, it's going to lead to a career, but a science career or some other kind? Well, you said clinical, so.
I think my ultimate dream, honestly, Shinzen, would probably be to do a little bit of each, like a little science, a little clinical work, and a little bit of teaching meditation, and somehow just weave them together. That's kind of the dream.
welcome to the team. That's a new profession. I mean, seriously, that is a new profession. A little bit of a scientist, a little bit of a clinician, and teaching meditation on the side, and they're all one thing, really, because that's the field. So looks like you're going in the same general direction that I'm interested in. So obviously anything that I can do to be of assistance. One thing, well, it's not one thing, a dozen things come to mind based on what you've told me so far, but let's just start with one thing. And this may or may not relate to the quote problems that you mentioned that you're encountering, which of course is what I want to hear about. But general principle, if you're approaching practice systems from a scientific point of view, many of those practice systems will be associated with traditions. And not all, but many of those traditions will be from Asia, India, China, and such. But as you well know, there are Western lineages that are quite legitimate contemplative practices. In encountering these traditions, you'll encounter terms in the languages of these traditions. Like, for example, the word Tantra with its adjective tantric. One of the pivotal innovations that was part of the secret sauce that makes modern science what it is was people like Francis Bacon insisting that we train ourselves to be sensitive to context. You can look up his 4 idols. His thinking needs modernization, but you can get the general idea. And it's important. It really helped create the experimental method. And so be very, very careful about words, because they mean different things or similar things or complicated related things in different contexts. They have different emotional valence and history in different contexts. When you're dealing with a place like India, which is called a subcontinent, it is huge. It has 3,000 years of history, approximately. I mean, tens of thousands if you go back to archaeology, but a long history of a literate culture. Be very careful about the adjective tantric. It means different things at different times in different places. And it would be very easy for a scientist to not, to give that short shrift, which would be equivalent to a meditator from a cave deciding they're going to get a modern education, but deciding that the difference between energy, force, power, and action, they shouldn't be different. These physicists say they're different, but I think they should all be the same thing. Well, that person does not have a sensitivity, in this case, to the definitions, okay? The scientist has to have a sensitivity that in different historical and modern social contexts, words can mean different things. There is Hindu Tantra, there's Buddhist Tantra, there's Jain Tantra. Each one of them have hundreds of years of history, and that history is spread over India. And those words meant very different things at different times. Sure, there's something that sort of holds them together. But if you start talking about, you know, tantric, and that's all you're talking about, to an Indologist, that's like talking about talking about Western religions, when really you're describing Lutheran Christians. Lutheran Christians shouldn't be called Western religions. They represent something specific. So I would just encourage you to never take a Sanskrit or Pali or Tibetan or Chinese Buddhist term and think it has a single meaning. Be very, very careful. And that would be the first thing to come to mind. Intimacy associated with sexuality, wow. That'll definitely get you a literary career. Actually, it's already gotten one of my students a whole career. Really, seriously. She writes on this subject.
May I interject briefly, or
yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to respond to your points before I get too many of them. One, I completely and totally agree, which is why I feel really passionate about involving religious scholars. So when I embarked on this project, I asked my neurology professor if it would be okay if I got a Buddhist scholar to consult me on creating operational definitions and looking at concepts, which is not traditional in academia, and he agreed, so I'm very grateful. And it's definitely been interesting trying to bridge the two, because there's a lot less dialogue than you would imagine going on. And one of the reasons is exactly this point. So actually part of the reason I'm interested in getting a PhD specifically in this area is that I think there is a huge amount of ambiguity and confusion.
You mentioned, quote, meditation over here, and then I thought you mentioned, as a contrast, Tantra over here. How do you see the relationship between those two words?
Well, we are getting into my imaginary PhD here, so I'm a lot less knowledgeable and in-depth about this than I am about my current research. But my understanding is that tantric traditions are a subset of larger yogic and meditative contemplative traditions throughout the world that share certain qualities and characteristics with each other. And I think those qualities and characteristics have been debated over time and through different scholars. But my understanding is that one of the distinctions that's been made is that they offer a form of spiritual practice that embraces material reality as a vehicle to emptiness and as an extension of emptiness in certain traditions. And so there's different practices that use, for instance, things like negative emotions or other things that different traditions have not used in spiritual practice. And it's more all-encompassing to use everything as a direct relationship to source. But this is my very rudimentary definition, nothing I would ever put in an academic paper. And so the idea of doing the PhD would be to refine this and offer better definitions, because it feels like there aren't good definitions right now. And to really do the traditions a better justice, give them more honor by disambiguating so many of these terms. This is my future dream, not what I'm doing right now.
Well, we have to prepare one step at a time. So what, let me reverse roles and say, if you were my advisor and I was doing my thesis on this, here's how I would formulate it. This is me though, just to give you an idea. If I was presented with writing a thesis in this area. I think I would first, I think you need to ask yourself well, now I'm talking to you again, but you understand what I'm saying. One would ask oneself, how wide of a notion do I want to create here? Right. I'm going to create a concept. That's what academics do. Hopefully, those concepts are useful to people in the world. So we're going to create a concept. How wide do we want to go? Do we want to go to more or less work within late Hindu Tantra? That's a concept. Do we want to work broadly within Hindu Tantra? Do we want to extend to Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain Tantra? Each of the three has their own, which is essentially to look at the full range of what has been, quote, Tantra in India. Do we want to look broader to approaches from over the world that may have some intersection and so forth with this? Of course, actually, we have to look at all of this before even deciding, right? And I'm sure this has occurred to you. I will say broadly, Tantra is a Sanskrit word. It comes from India. There is the culture of Greater India, which you should become familiar with. You probably are already. You know what that means geographically and historically. So many things developed in India will spread to Greater India. And they'll spread beyond India to the Middle East, the West, and China, big time. So if I were to speak within the context of Buddhist Tantra, I think I could speak with some confidence. That's what I was going to do my PhD on. Until I realized I'll never understand this shit until I actually experience it. And I didn't, you know, it's like, took a little longer than I expected. So that's why I have no status. I'm ABD, all but dissertation PhD. But I think I wrote my PhD. I wrote my PhD in the school of getting results. So I can tell you how I would characterize to a gross oversimplification the Buddhist tantric tradition, to a gross oversimplification. It's a certain version of what you're saying. It's a way of working smart with sensory phenomena to get deep results. It's a way to work smart with certain, it's using certain opportunities that have certain characteristics and doing that in a systematic way. To me, that's the most important innovation. But that innovation is covered over by layer after layer after layer after layer after layer of history, intersect, rivalry, warfare, gurus, screwing gurus, and all that enters in to, this is the way to do it. No, that's the way to do it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a central innovation that is, and the reason that I would do a PhD on it is it has relevance to the modern world. Otherwise, the PhD is cultural enrichment. Great. There's nothing wrong with, I'm all in favor of cultural enrichment. But if you want to do something that has some relevance to the modern world, and the modern world is in trouble, in case no one noticed, then you want to look for, to be tautological, you want to look for things that are relevant. Well, the general principle of working cleverly with a system of different kinds of physiological and other altered states, that's relevant. I built it into my system, of course, because I stole everything from other people. You could say I stood on the shoulders of giants, or you can say I'm the biggest ganef in the history of spirituality. Ganef is a Yiddish word meaning someone who steals things in business. You know, so-and-so, that business guy over there, he's a ganef, watch out for him. So anyway, what they chose was interesting, but other traditions have chosen other similar stuff. And the early Buddhist tradition with its jhana practices actually makes use of a lot of the same material. And they would so contrast. They would say, forget what, that's small vehicle. Tekpa Membo, that's like the little vehicle. We're the blah, 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 blah. The latest operating system, but really it's got a lot of overlap with early Buddhism. It's just now been covered over with mythology and politics and et cetera, et cetera. So I would say there's lower Tantra and higher Tantra within Buddhist Tantra. My ordination is in lower Tantra, actually, technically. Shinzen that's my name. That's a lineage name from Shingon Buddhism. Tibetans would say I only knew the lower forms of Tantra, but I know the higher forms because I read books and they've been published now. So I haven't been initiated into them, but I'm pretty confident I know how they work. So there's a difference between the clever thing that the lower Tantra people do, which is then, of course, grandfathered into higher Tantra, but then there's these other clever things that the higher Tantra people do, which are more physiological. The lower Tantra is more about merging through visualizations and deity yoga, that kind of thing. And that's the centerpiece of Shingon. But then what the Tibetans do is they add all this physiological stuff from Hatha Yoga. But that's just adding physiological stuff from Hatha Yoga. Anyone could do that. The clever thing is to work it into a system where it relates to Buddhist emptiness, compassion, and so forth. And that's what they did. But other traditions use other altered states, other physiologies. And also the actual sexual practices as they may have existed in Tibet or other places, as opposed to what is written on the page. There's a Westerner who was what do they call that? The karmamudra or something, basically consort in English, basically girlfriend or wife on the side. I don't want to characterize it, but there was a Westerner who was that for one of the top Rinpoches. And she said what it was actually, and it's not exactly like what you would think from reading in the book. Mm-hmm. So there's that. There's the reality of, So if you want to talk about physical intimacy between humans, and how it relates to meditation practice, yeah, we can talk about that. And that's a much broader context. That would include all traditions. Yeah, so.
I have a few points.
Yeah, go ahead.
Your definition is obviously much more concise than mine, and I wasn't prepared to go into this topic, but I think it's in a similar vein as what I'm thinking. I also felt under the definition of relating to each moment and everything that arises in it as a potential direct vehicle to source, I felt your book was very tantric, in that you encourage the same skills to be utilized regardless of what is arising in the moment. Which
I'm not sure that's the best way to look at what characterizes tantric, because each moment as a vehicle is not what I got from Tantra. Oh, I got it from them, but in a different way. It was more through symbolism and ritual, and a philosophical view that was very, very helpful. And we can go into the details of that, how I was inculcated. But the general approach that I use also, as you say, it seems like, oh yeah, every moment of ordinary experience is where we practice. That is absolutely as characteristic of Chan as it is of Tantra. And if you make a dichotomy that Tantra, what characterizes Tantra is it's about this flavor of embodiment, I think you're going in a direction that's not the best conceptual map, because actually each of the three Buddhist vehicles would say in our own way, each moment is. What Tantra does, at least Buddhist Tantra, is it does that in a specific way that was relevant to a specific time in a specific culture. And the components that they chose all fit together to form a system that works very well. But I think you already know this, but people listening in might not. By the time Tantric or Vajrayana Buddhism comes about, the Buddha is no longer the Buddha as I would understand him. As I would understand the Buddha was a person who was an extraordinary meditator and an extraordinary creative expositor, and came up with discoveries in the contemplative path that no one else had come up with. And so he was an innovator. He wasn't, quote, just deeply liberated. He figured out new stuff and it changed the world. So that's my understanding. He's a proto-scientist. But by the time just a few centuries had passed, no one thought they could ever become a Buddha, because Buddha had become mythologized. You're 16 feet high, have a golden body, 100,000 lifetimes of sacrificing yourself and making good karma is what you need to get that kind of body. And if you don't have that kind of body, you can't be a Buddha, blah, blah, blah. How do you reach these people with something that's relevant to practice? Oh, easy. We'll make you a Buddha instantly. Visualize yourself as the Buddha, replace your mental talk with the Buddha's mantra, visualize the Buddha in front as well as over here, visualize yourself in an environment where the Buddha has put the body physically in a mudra, and attend to the mantra, to the emotions associated with that. Your samadhi has as its content the archetype until you merge and you live the myth. Right here and now, you can become a Buddha in this lifetime. But that was a message to a culture that had a certain problem. They'd forgotten early Buddhism. And then that's a little later, we've got that culture with all sorts of fancy schmancy yoga practices. Great, let's use it, but let's show how to make that for realization of emptiness and then show how from the emptiness you have to come back to a self that functions, to an activity of self, which can still be the archetype. You can be channeling your humanity through that archetype, but we're now actually doing something that is of benefit to people. So they weaved altered physiology into deep, getting emptiness into a cellular level. And they would use sex sometimes, either visualized or physical. But I don't think they had a concept of intimacy. I mean, it would be there because it's there, but I'm not sure how much of that concept is in the tantric tradition. It's much more identifying with archetypes that are, whatever. But the intimacy thing is very relevant to the modern world. And as I say, I have a student that's what she does. She writes books on mindfulness and sex. So I would say they did a special job for a certain culture of the general job of form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Chan people do it differently, and the Vipassana people do it differently. But I would say that's what I would say. That those, I think, are the most important dimensions to look at.
If I might interject, this is totally fascinating, but I want to just give an opportunity to redirect to Chelsey, your current research. I ought to add perhaps that the student, I think Shinzen you're referring to, is Jessica Graham. Is that correct?
That's correct.
About intimacy.
Yes.
Jessica Graham. Yeah, and Mindful Sex, I think maybe it's her book. I'll reference it in the show notes. But Chelsey, you actually have some thorny definitional problems that are include a lot of these overlaps of history, of different sects and different understanding and interpretations in your research. Perhaps it might be an opportunity to pivot into that problem. Maybe you could state it.
Yes, so the exact themes that you are talking about here in relation to this vast swath of quote unquote tantric lineages are the same problems I'm coming across in specific in my research, which is just the vastness of definitions. And the thing I'm specifically trying to define for the purposes of this review and potential future research is what you call a special nothing, but it's the experience of a special nothing. There's only been one scale that I've found that's been created, which calls this non-dual awareness. And in this scale, they link together various traditions that have a conception of the experience of non-dual awareness. So one of the questions I really wanted to ask you on this call is that I've been struggling with is, are these experiences of special nothing or non-dual awareness necessarily the same across traditions, or could the context, practice, and conception of the endpoint of practice potentially inform the actual experience of the emptiness or of the non-self state? So could you have like a Christ-flavored emptiness if you go through Christ? Or could you have, if you believe that emptiness is empty versus that emptiness has form, would your experience of emptiness then be different? So I looked at your work and I found various examples of, you could say, complementary or different views on it. In your book, you have a whole chapter comparing different traditions and talking about the overlap. On the other hand, on page 197, you say you can arrive at zero in a lot of different ways, which in turn give you different experiences. The experience of nothing is path dependent, so to speak. So I'm very curious to get your answer on this topic.
What's the contrasting quote, Chelsey?
The initial part is not so much about a quote per se, but there's these lists of names for special nothingness from different traditions.
Oh, yeah.
implies a fundamental similarity in experience, or that there's something that could be experienced exactly similarly or very close to it if one would only penetrate deeply enough into this special nothingness from any particular angle, if this is making sense.
It is totally making sense. And I think although I in general try to be very careful, one of the things that I have discovered is even people that are good at it and try to be careful about it sometimes don't say what they mean. And your question is highlighting that. And these are the good questions. The questions where the authority had a bad day.
I wasn't saying questions.
No, but it's entirely possible, because I tell you, I do. And the quality of what comes out of me is quite different. And I look back and I see all these little mistakes. It's coming at what's happening now. It's so exciting. And, you know, we are living in a different era. That is for sure. So I don't train the coaches in my system. Someone else trains them. And her name is Juliana Ray. So, I mean, she was with me for decades. She was with a very senior Zen master for decades. You know, she's done training. So what she does is she's made this very impressive international, well, English language, but international training program. And what happens is she feeds back to me the confusion points of the students. So this is completely removed from me. No, anything that I have done this or that. When she tries to convey my ideas, certain patterns of difficulty appear where, God damn it, I thought I had nailed it. Absolutely not. There, she says, look, a whole bunch of people can't get this. A whole bunch of people. And then we hash it out. It's like, okay, you know what? I didn't really say what I meant. And now this leads me to realize, imagine in the old days when these teachers were really authority figures. They said this and they said that. Who's going to challenge it? Who's going to point this out? It's so refreshing to live in the modern era where, while I'm still alive, my, mistakes and whatever, or inaccuracies in formulating it, I get a chance to at least, correct some of that. So it's entirely possible that's a real contradiction, and I was using language not consistently. So this is something we can discuss.
Well, just to be clear, I was certainly not trying to critique your work, but rather...
Well, you should, though. This is science. Chelsey, this is science. That's the difference.
I actually had a third potential hypothesis.
Do critique.
Okay.
The Nobel laureate has to defend the same way the PhD candidate. That's what makes science so...
I thought you might share my potential third hypotheses, which is that there might be similarities and differences, that there could be some underlying state that has similarities in traditions, but also has differences based on potential neurological variability due to plasticity over time from different practices, or something.
Yeah.
So I was hoping that you shared some sort of view of that nature, not trying to critique.
Let me see but that's, that's my soapbox. That's the whole thing. That's what the gurus of the world one of the things the gurus of the world have to learn from science is a new flavor of humility. They have amazing old flavors, but I can be wrong. I can have a bad day. A beginning student has something to say about the formulation that took me 60 years in science. Yeah. And now in this. And that makes it relevant to the modern world. So sorry, I got all, whatever, because that's what I think is so cool. So I suspect that, okay, well, let's tell a different story. Let's say there's broadly two sides to practice. Get over yourself and transcend the world is one, and refine yourself and serve the world is another. That's pretty, in a mature formulation, that's either going to be explicit or implicit, and that's present in Christian practice, not just Buddhism. Okay, so from that perspective, the experience of get over yourself and transcend the world, in its mature form, in other words, we might call it the liberation aspect for a term, in its mature form, I suspect is the same thing across all traditions, across all humans. However, the way a person chooses to think about it for themselves, or the ways in which they choose to think about it, the ways that way that they may express to others, that is very idiosyncratic and depends on a lot of factors. And so that's what's so frustrating, because same words mean something different for Guru X, different words mean the same thing for gurus Y and Z. And it's like the words, I mean, where are we going to go? Find the true self. You can find Buddhists that will teach that. My teacher taught me that. That's the koan that did it for me. Who are you? Find the true self. But when you, quote, answer that koan, you realize there truly never was a thing called a self. So there is no self. And Buddhists and Hindus fought over that in India. They debated those words. But then others said, we don't know whether to laugh or cry. How could you debate the words? It's like an elephant, blind, you're like blind men. That's where that metaphor comes from. So I suspect that in its mature form, which might take a lifetime, even if you're a monk, and certainly you could be a monk and never even get remotely near there. Cuculus non facit monachum. A cowl does not make a monk. So I suspect that where it converges to experientially is pretty similar. But how the person talks about it, how they think about it, is going to differ. And that's where we get into an area that is not in my specialty, which is, well, if you're having the same experience, but you're talking about it and thinking about it differently, is it the same experience? That is a philosophical issue. But I can tell you as a teacher, I strongly suspect that very senior adepts have pretty much the same experience as far as the liberation aspect goes. But it may be hard to tell that without having some very clear communication. People respecting each other's traditions, but also being uncensored in their interactions. And there's no clock or date. We're going to have this conversation until we're clear. I suspect that if we got the different senior adepts that may, at a given time, be saying, no, it's this, no, it's that, and created the right communication protocol and gave them enough time, I suspect it would hash out. It's totally integrated in me. I talk about it a dozen different ways. They're exactly the same for me.
Yes, I think, I mean, the problem you point to about if people are describing things differently, is it the same thing? And how can we actually know the content of one's experience is simply a hard problem of consciousness studies.
Yeah.
My dream, and I'm sure that, or I hope you may share this, which I don't think will happen within my lifetime. The real way to get an actual answer to this would be to study states of non-dual awareness or special nothingness, or whatever word we choose to use based on the tradition, in different advanced practitioners from both subjective, objective, and philosophical standpoints, and compare. And then we would be able to establish correlations or relationships between the first and third person data of each individual experience, as well as between the various experiences. And then we'd have an answer. But this is quite a far ways away. So for now, it's kind of speculation. However, I do agree with you that studying things in a somewhat interdisciplinary manner may lead to more accuracy, or at least that's my interest, because like you say, when you have the lens of a specific discipline, you often get answers that are confined by that particular lens, which for me comes back to the initial problem we keep discussing, which is how to translate ideas from cultures whose lens was completely different to a new lens and have the concept remain the same, or elucidate the differences between the two concepts as we translate them, so that we do justice to the tradition and create accurate operational definitions, which is the whole problem I came across. I thought I was going to get into neurology, and I spent 3 months looking at this issue, just this issue, because it's so
That's
dense.
right. Now, let me reverse the telescope a little bit and say that this issue, what you have encountered, is a very, very big issue. And it may not be the case that the way to go about things is to somehow resolve the terminology issue and then move forward. The terminology issue may turn out to be a harder problem than the neurobiology, believe it or not, in the end.
Yeah. Sure, I would be totally willing to believe that.
Yeah. So the work you're doing now is a good etude. It's a good practice for, addressing these problems. It's not a waste of time.
Yes. Well, it's. I mean, you spend a great deal of time in your What is Mindfulness PDF and talking about definition creation. And I think I love your chart where you look at the different ways to define things. And I think it matters for various reasons. One being because if we create large umbrella terms, we then have to do later work of disambiguating those things in order to have small enough bite-sized scientific definitions. But two, which is more important to me, is that there's this bidirectional relationship between the definitions we create in science and what people think things are. So as we create definitions, we create concepts, and those concepts could then actually be affecting people's practices. And that's what really motivates my heart more than my head, is that I feel the scientific community has a responsibility to people's lives that the truths that they create affect. So that's my interest in it. I do agree with you that I could sort of bypass it easily. But I see so much misinformation happening, and I watch it affecting people's practices negatively. And so it deeply concerns me. But I think you're right that the neurological phenomena would be easier to just jump to. And I have a ton of theories about that, which I think we're not going to have time for.
Well, maybe we should have another session.
I would love that. Oh my God. Yeah. I mean,
Can we do that?
We absolutely can. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's let's just make a part 2 because we're just getting going.
Yes, that's delightful. I have 5 different hypotheses about the potential neurological mechanisms of non-dual awareness that I prepared for you today to try to go over with you, some of which include your ideas at the end of your book and some of which are my own thinkings based on research I've read. So we can cover that next time. But
how many did you say you had?
Well, it's a kind of
3, 5.
It's 4 main ones, and then there's a kind of conglomeration that could be happening.
Cool.
Yeah,
we'll get into it.
That sounds like quite the sequel. So I think part 2. This is a cliffhanger. This is the quite a cliffhanger. So part 2, we'll get into Chelsey's 5 theories and dive deeper into the neurological aspect of this. So Shinzen Young, Chelsey Fasano, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you too.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.